The Galactic Broadcasting Network received 847,392 formal complaints, 3 diplomatic incidents, and 1 species-wide panic attack, all because of a single documentary about what they thought was the most dangerous planet in the known universe. The only problem: they got the wrong planet. Well, technically they got the right planet, but for all the wrong reasons, and somehow that made it infinitely worse. Crimpleton Bizzlewaff had always considered himself the unluckiest being in 17 solar systems. His luck was so catastrophically bad that his own mother had once bet against him in a probability lottery and won. So when the assignment landed on his desk with the weight of a collapsing neutron star, he wasn't particularly surprised. What did surprise him was that someone, somewhere in the vast bureaucratic nightmare that was the Galactic Confederation, had decided that he was the perfect candidate to make a documentary about Class 15 Deathworlds. Class 15 Deathworlds! His supervisor, Gruntleberry Weaselbonk, had announced with the enthusiasm of someone announcing a particularly virulent plague. The most dangerous classification in our entire system. Planets so hostile that just looking at them through a telescope requires a safety waiver. Crimpleton stared at the file folder that seemed to radiate malevolence. Inside was a single sheet of paper with coordinates, a planet designation, and a classification that made his tentacles go numb. "But sir, I specialize in nature documentaries about peaceful meadow creatures who spend their entire lives eating flowers and humming pleasant melodies." "Exactly." Weaselbonk's eye stalks wiggled with what might have been joy or possibly a neurological disorder. Fresh perspective. Besides, nobody else would take the assignment. Literally nobody. We asked the entire department. Twice. The planet in question was called Earth by its inhabitants, though the Galactic Survey had designated it as Planetary Body XJ739b in Sector Zulu 12. What made this particularly interesting was that according to the official records, it had been classified as a Class 15 Deathworld by Junior Survey Officer Binglebert Snodgrass exactly 47 years, 3 months, and 16 days ago. Snodgrass had long since retired to a pleasant cottage on Flibber Prime, where he spent his days tending to his collection of singing crystals and trying very hard not to remember why he'd quit his job so suddenly. The truth was that Snodgrass had made what could charitably be called a clerical error. After a particularly exhausting survey mission involving a planet populated entirely by carnivorous mathematics, he had submitted his reports while suffering from acute space lag and a mild case of dimensional hiccups. Instead of classifying Earth as a Class 1 standard biosphere with mild atmospheric oxygen variations, he had somehow managed to tick every single danger box on the classification form. All of them, including several that weren't supposed to be possible simultaneously. The form had been processed by the Galactic Survey's automated systems, which had been programmed by the lowest bidder from a species that communicated primarily through interpretive flatulence. The computers, upon receiving a survey report that indicated a planet was simultaneously experiencing catastrophic volcanic activity, permanent ice age conditions, toxic atmosphere, radiation levels incompatible with known physics, and temporal anomalies causing Tuesday to occur 3 times per week, had done what any sensible artificial intelligence would do. They had classified it as a Class 15 Deathworld and marked the file as "Do not approach under any circumstances whatsoever." 47 years later, the file had never been opened, until now. Crimpleton spent the next 3 weeks preparing for what he assumed would be his final assignment. He purchased life insurance, updated his will, and wrote a lengthy letter to his ex-wife, explaining that while their marriage had been a disaster of cosmic proportions, he still hoped she would remember him fondly after he was inevitably dissolved by acid rain or eaten by something with too many teeth. The journey to Earth took approximately 2 galactic standard months, during which Crimpleton had plenty of time to study the sparse information available about his destination. The survey data was confusing. According to the files, Earth was inhabited by a species called humans, who were apparently so dangerous that they had somehow managed to survive on a planet that should have killed them 17 different ways before breakfast. Humans, he muttered to himself while reviewing the files for the 100th time, are apparently capable of surviving temperatures that would flash freeze liquid nitrogen, consuming substances that would dissolve titanium, and engaging in recreational activities that involve deliberately launching themselves through the atmosphere with nothing but fabric wings. What he didn't realize was that the information had been compiled by cross-referencing Earth's entry with tourism brochures from 17 different vacation planets, medical reports from a species that lived in sulfuric acid pools, and an adventure sports catalogue from the Extreme Recreation Council of Vega 7. His ship, the definitely not going to explode this time, had been specially retrofitted for Class 15 exploration. This meant it had approximately 14 backup systems for every primary system, emergency protocols for situations that hadn't been invented yet, and a medical bay that could theoretically rebuild him from his constituent atoms if necessary. The ship's AI, which had been programmed with a cheerfully optimistic personality that bordered on the psychotic, greeted him each morning with updates like, "Good morning, Crimpleton. Today's chance of horrible death has decreased to only 73.6%. Isn't that wonderful?" As Earth grew larger in his view screen, Crimpleton couldn't help but notice that it looked remarkably pleasant. Blue oceans, white clouds, green continents. It looked like the kind of planet where peaceful meadow creatures might actually exist. This struck him as odd, since Class 15 Deathworlds were typically characterized by landscapes that looked like they had been designed by a committee of particularly vindictive demons. Maybe, he thought hopefully, the dangerous parts are on the dark side of the planet. He was wrong, but not in the way he expected. Crimpleton's first mistake was landing his ship in what his instruments identified as a low-risk pastoral zone. Ndut. What his instruments failed to mention was that this particular pastoral zone was actually someone's backyard in the small English village of Lower Bumblethwaite, and that someone was a 63-year-old retired librarian named Prudence Wiggleswift, who had very strong opinions about uninvited visitors. His second mistake was assuming that the small, seemingly harmless creature approaching his ship with what appeared to be a ceremonial weapon was some sort of native welcoming committee. "Get off my petunias!" Prudence shouted, brandishing a garden hose with the kind of righteous fury usually reserved for religious wars. "I don't care if you're from the council or the tax office or bloody Mars. Those are prize-winning petunias, and I'll not have some strange metal contraption parked on top of them." Crimpleton, observing this display through his ship's heavily armored view screen, made careful notes. Subject appears to be a human female, approximately 1.6 meters in height, wielding what appears to be a fluid-based projectile weapon. Demonstrates typical human aggression patterns when territorial boundaries are violated. Remarkable lung capacity. Note: investigate possible connection between vocal volume and combat effectiveness. What he was actually witnessing was Prudence having what she would later describe to her sister as a perfectly reasonable reaction to finding a spaceship in her garden. Duh! But to Crimpleton, who had spent weeks preparing to encounter the galaxy's most dangerous species, this was clearly a demonstration of human military tactics. When Prudence turned on the garden hose and began spraying his ship, Crimpleton's instruments went mad. Alarms began blaring, warning systems activated, and the ship's AI announced in its insufferably cheerful voice, "Warning! The vessel is under attack by an unknown liquid-based weapon system. Defensive protocols activated. Have a nice day." "Dear God!" Crimpleton shrieked, his voice reaching octaves that shouldn't have been possible for his species. They're attacking with some sort of chemical warfare. The briefings were right. They are the most dangerous species in the galaxy. Meanwhile, Prudence continued her assault on what she assumed was some sort of elaborate prank by the neighborhood teenagers. "Take that, you mechanical monstrosity! And that! I spent 3 months getting those petunias to bloom properly." The situation escalated when Prudence's neighbor, Reginald Butterworth Smythe, emerged from his own garden to investigate the commotion. Reginald was a 70-year-old former postal worker who had spent the better part of 4 decades delivering mail to every corner of Lower Bumblethwaite, which had given him the kind of practical wisdom that only comes from dealing with people's problems on a daily basis. "Prudence," he called out, adjusting his glasses to get a better look at the peculiar silver object that had apparently taken up residence in her garden. "What's all this racket about? And why is there Is that a spaceship in your petunias?" "I don't care what it is," Prudence replied, maintaining her offensive with the garden hose. "It's ruining my garden, and it's going to pay for every damaged flower." Crimpleton, observing this exchange, frantically updated his notes. "Multiple human subjects have converged on the landing site. They appear to be coordinating a group assault. The second subject seems to be conducting reconnaissance, while the first maintains suppressive fire with the liquid weapon system. Recommend immediate withdrawal to safe distance." But Crimpleton was nothing if not dedicated to his profession. Despite every instinct screaming at him to flee immediately, he activated his ship's external communication system and attempted to make first contact. The result was a sound that emerged from his ship's speakers like a cross between a dolphin having an anxiety attack and a modem trying to sing opera. This had an immediate and profound effect on both humans, though not quite the effect Crimpleton had intended. "Bloody hell!" Prudence exclaimed, dropping her garden hose in surprise. "It's talking to us. Reginald, it's some sort of alien spaceship and it's talking." Reginald, who had lived through the London Blitz, the great postal strike of 1978, and his wife's experimental cooking phase, took this development with admirable calm. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "that's something new. Do you suppose it's friendly?" Crimpleton, realizing that his initial attempt at communication had failed, tried again. This time he managed to activate his universal translator, which had been programmed to handle over 40,000 different languages, dialects, and forms of interpretive dance. What emerged from his speakers was marginally more comprehensible. "Greetings. Dangerous humans, I am Crimpleton Bizzlewarf, documentary filmmaker from the Galactic Broadcasting Network. I come in peace to study your terrifying ways." There was a moment of profound silence in the garden of Lower Bumblethwaite. A silence so complete that you could actually hear the petunias wondering what the hell was going on. Then Prudence did something that would change the course of galactic history. She started laughing. Not just laughing. Cackling. The kind of deep, uncontrollable laughter that comes from a lifetime of dealing with bureaucrats, teenagers, and the general absurdity of modern life. She laughed until tears streamed down her face and she had to lean against her garden fence for support. "Terrifying ways!" she gasped between fits of laughter. "Reginald, did you hear that? He thinks we're terrifying. Me, a retired librarian from Lower Bumblethwaite. Oh, this is rich!" Reginald, who had always prided himself on his ability to find humor in even the most unusual situations, began to chuckle as well. "Dangerous humans, eh? Wait until he meets the parish council." Crimpleton, observing this display of what he assumed was some sort of human battle cry or intimidation ritual, made more notes. Human subjects appear to be engaging in a psychological warfare technique involving rhythmic vocalizations and the expulsion of bodily fluids from their optical organs. Effectiveness unclear, but definitely unsettling. Recommend maintaining safe distance. What happened next would be remembered by the residents of Lower Bumblethwaite as the day that aliens discovered Earth's most dangerous weapon, British hospitality. "Well then," Reginald said, straightening his cardigan and walking toward the spaceship with the sort of determined politeness that had made the British Empire simultaneously beloved and feared throughout the known galaxy. "You'd better come in for tea." And that, as they say, was when things got really interesting. Crimpleton's first experience with human hospitality began with what he would later describe in his documentary as the ritual of beverage-based warfare. Reginald had invited him into his sitting room, which Crimpleton immediately identified as some sort of strategic command center based on the number of books, newspapers, and what appeared to be tactical planning documents scattered about. What he was actually looking at was the accumulated detritus of a man who enjoyed crossword puzzles, gardening magazines, and had a mild obsession with collecting unusual teacups. "Now then," Reginald said, bustling about his kitchen with the efficiency of someone who had been making tea for longer than most civilizations had existed, milk and sugar. Crimpleton, still wearing his full environmental protection suit, stared at this question through his heavily tinted visor. His universal translator was having difficulty with the concept, eventually settling on, query, "Do you wish to consume lactose-based nutritional fluid and crystallized plant-derived carbohydrates?" Yes," Crimpleton replied uncertainly, wondering if this was some sort of ritual challenge. Prudence, who had dried her eyes and composed herself enough to join them, settled into an armchair that had probably witnessed more of British history than most museums. "So," she said with the kind of directness that came from dealing with difficult library patrons for 30 years, "you're here to make a documentary about us being dangerous?" "Indeed," Crimpleton replied, grateful to be back on familiar professional ground. "According to our records, your species has managed to survive on a Class 15 Deathworld, which makes you among the most formidable beings in the known galaxy." Reginald paused in his tea-making. "Class 15 Deathworld? What's that when it's at home?" "The most dangerous planetary classification possible," Crimpleton explained enthusiastically. "Worlds so hostile that most species wouldn't survive 5 minutes on the surface. Your planet has been classified as having catastrophic volcanic activity, permanent ice age conditions, toxic atmosphere, radiation levels that defy known physics, and temporal anomalies." Prudence and Reginald exchanged glances. "Temporal anomalies?" Prudence asked. "According to our files, Tuesday occurs 3 times per week on your planet." There was another moment of profound silence, broken only by the gentle whistle of Reginald's kettle reaching optimal temperature. "Well," Reginald said thoughtfully, "some weeks do feel longer than others." And so began what would become known throughout the galaxy as the most accidentally misleading documentary in the history of interplanetary broadcasting. Over the course of the next several weeks, Crimpleton followed Prudence and Reginald around Lower Bumblethwaite, documenting what he believed to be the survival techniques of the galaxy's most dangerous species. When he filmed Prudence tending her garden, he provided commentary about advanced agricultural warfare techniques and the human ability to force hostile plant life into submission through pure determination. When she used pesticide spray on her roses, he described it as chemical weapons deployment against enemy arthropod forces. When he recorded Reginald doing his weekly shopping at the village store, he narrated it as a dangerous foraging expedition into hostile territory, where humans must compete for limited resources using a complex system of paper tokens and metallic discs. The elderly shopkeeper, Mrs. Cranklebottom, became a territorial guardian who controls access to vital supplies through ritualistic bartering ceremonies. But it was when Crimpleton documented what he called human combat training that things really got interesting. Every Tuesday evening, the Lower Bumblethwaite Community Centre hosted what Reginald described as a gentle fitness class for the over 60s. What Crimpleton filmed was something he would later present to the galaxy as advanced military conditioning for elite human warriors. The class was led by Millicent Snodgrass, a 75-year-old former dance instructor who had decided that retirement was overrated and had taken up teaching aerobics. Millicent approached fitness with the same enthusiasm she had once brought to teaching the foxtrot, which is to say, with boundless energy and a complete disregard for the physical limitations of her students. "Right then, everyone!" Millicent announced to her class of 12 senior citizens, all of whom were wearing tracksuits in various shades of pastel. "Today, we're going to work on our core strength. Remember, if it doesn't challenge you, it won't change you." Crimpleton, hidden behind what he thought was adequate camouflage, a potted plant that fooled absolutely nobody, filmed what he believed was intensive military training. His commentary, which would later be broadcast to 847 different species across 17 galaxies, went something like this. Observe the human training ritual. The pack leader, identified as Millicent, begins with intimidation tactics, establishing dominance through aggressive vocalizations. Note how the other humans immediately assume submission postures, acknowledging her authority. What he was actually watching was 12 pensioners doing gentle stretching exercises. Now witness their incredible physical conditioning. Despite their advanced age, these human warriors are capable of maintaining combat positions for extended periods. The combat positions were actually modified yoga poses, specifically designed for people with arthritis and questionable knees. Remarkable. Observe how they coordinate their breathing patterns to maximize oxygen intake before engaging in combat maneuvers. They were doing meditation breathing exercises because Millicent believed it helped with stress. The documentary really hit its stride when Crimpleton decided to conduct what he called in-depth interviews with human military specialists. His first subject was Barnaby Crumplebottom, a retired accountant who had spent 40 years managing the books for a small manufacturing company that made specialty hinges for garden gates. Crimpleton's interview technique had been developed through years of documentary work with peaceful meadow creatures, which meant he asked very direct questions and expected very simple answers. This approach created some interesting results when applied to humans. "Tell me about your combat experience," Crimpleton began, his recording equipment humming softly in the background. Barnaby, who had been told by Prudence that the alien wanted to learn about their daily lives, interpreted this question in the context of his weekly struggle with his vegetable garden. "Well," he said thoughtfully, "every year I wage war against the slugs, vicious little blighters. They'll destroy an entire lettuce crop overnight if you're not careful." Crimpleton's eye stalks perked up. "Warfare against hostile native species. Please, describe your tactics." "Oh, the usual," Barnaby replied, warming to the subject. "Beer traps mostly. Copper strips around the raised beds. Sometimes I go out at night with a flashlight and a bucket of salt water. Pick them off one by one. Takes patience, but you've got to be ruthless with slugs." Crimpleton made frantic notes. Subject describes nocturnal hunting expeditions using illumination technology and chemical weapons. Demonstrates advanced predator elimination techniques. Note, investigate human ability to wage biological warfare against multiple enemy species simultaneously. The interview got even more interesting when Barnaby began describing his ongoing conflict with the local deer population. "Course, the real challenge is the deer," Barnaby continued. "Clever devils. They'll watch your garden for weeks, learning your routine, then strike when you're not expecting it. I've had to develop countermeasures." "Countermeasures?" Crimpleton leaned forward eagerly. "Motion sensors connected to sprinkler systems, reflective tape that flashes in the sunlight. Sometimes I'll leave a radio playing all night. Classical music seems to work better than pop. Don't ask me why. And if all else fails, there's always the netting. Crimpleton's recording equipment nearly overheated trying to process this information. Advanced surveillance technology, psychological warfare using audio-based deterrents, defensive fortifications. This species has clearly developed sophisticated military engineering capabilities. But the real breakthrough came when Barnaby mentioned his involvement with the Lower Bumblethwaite Village Defense League. "Defense League!" Crimpleton exclaimed, his voice reaching frequencies that made nearby dogs extremely nervous. "You have organized military units." "Well, I wouldn't call it military exactly," Barnaby said modestly. "We just keep an eye on things, you know? Make sure everyone's bins are put out on the right day, watch for suspicious characters, organize the annual fete. That sort of thing." What Barnaby was describing was essentially a neighborhood watch program with delusions of grandeur and an unhealthy obsession with proper refuse collection protocols. What Crimpleton heard was a description of a highly organized civilian militia with advanced logistics capabilities and sophisticated intelligence-gathering operations. "Tell me about your intelligence-gathering operations," Crimpleton pressed. "Oh, that's mostly down to Mrs. Pemberton," Barnaby replied. "She knows everything that goes on in the village. Position her behind her front curtains with a cup of tea and a packet of biscuits, and nothing gets past her. She spotted the Jenkins boy trying to nick apples from old Mr. Weatherby's orchard from 3 streets away. Got eyes like a hawk, that one." Crimpleton's notes were becoming increasingly frantic. "Advanced surveillance networks utilizing strategically positioned observation specialists. Capability to detect covert operations across significant distances. Individual operatives demonstrate enhanced sensory abilities beyond normal parameters." The interview reached its climax when Barnaby began describing the annual Lower Bumblethwaite Fun Run, which he characterized as good training for staying in shape. "We do it every spring," he explained. 5 kilometers through the countryside. Bit of competition keeps everyone motivated. Last year I came in 14th out of 37 participants. Not bad for someone my age. Crimpleton nearly fell off his chair. "Competitive endurance trials. Your species engages in ritual combat to establish dominance hierarchies." "Well, I wouldn't call it combat exactly," Barnaby said, though he was clearly pleased by the suggestion that his 14th place finish constituted some sort of military achievement. "Though Mrs. Pemberton can get a bit aggressive around the halfway mark, she's surprisingly fast for someone her age." By the time Crimpleton finished his interview with Barnaby, he was convinced he had discovered the most comprehensively militarized civilian population in the known galaxy. His documentary was shaping up to be a masterpiece of investigative journalism, revealing the terrifying truth about how humans had managed to survive on their impossible planet. The only problem was that none of it was actually true. But truth, as Crimpleton was about to discover, was a remarkably flexible concept when filtered through 47 years of bureaucratic mistakes, universal translation errors, and the fundamental impossibility of understanding an entire species based on spending 3 weeks in Lower Bumblethwaite. The documentary, titled Earth, Survival on the Edge of Impossible, premiered simultaneously on 1,247 different broadcasting networks across the galaxy. The opening sequence featured dramatic music that sounded like the soundtrack to the end of the universe, combined with footage of Prudence aggressively weeding her garden, while Crimpleton's voiceover described it as humans engaging in territorial purification rituals using specialized combat tools. The reaction was immediate and spectacular. On Flibble Prime, a planet populated by beings who communicated through color-changing tentacles, the entire population turned a shade of purple that roughly translated to, "Oh God, we're all going to die." The planetary government immediately went into emergency session and began drafting surrender documents, despite the fact that they had never actually met any humans and weren't entirely sure what they would be surrendering to. The Crystalline Confederation of Vega 7, whose members were essentially sentient rocks with delusions of grandeur, watched the documentary and immediately began fortifying their asteroid belt. The sight of Reginald doing his weekly shop at Mrs. Cranklebottom's store, which Crimpleton had described as high-stakes resource acquisition in a hostile commercial environment, convinced them that humans were capable of infiltrating and subverting any economic system in the galaxy. But the most dramatic reaction came from the tentacled philosophers of Betelgeuse 9, a species that spent most of their time contemplating the nature of existence and composing extremely long poems about the futility of life. The documentary segment on Millicent's aerobics class, presented as advanced combat conditioning for elderly human warriors, caused the entire species to have what could only be described as a collective nervous breakdown. If their elderly can maintain such physical conditioning, their chief philosopher, Squishbert Tentacleworth, announced to the emergency session of the Galactic Council, then what are their young warriors capable of? We must assume that humans have developed some sort of fountain of youth technology that allows their senior citizens to maintain peak combat effectiveness. Meanwhile, back on Earth, the residents of Lower Bumblethwaite remained blissfully unaware that they had accidentally become the most feared military force in the known galaxy. They continued their daily routines of tending gardens, attending fitness classes, and engaging in the sort of low-level village politics that had characterized British rural life for approximately the last 1,000 years. The first sign that something unusual was happening came when Reginald noticed an unusual number of shooting stars in the night sky. What he was actually seeing were emergency evacuation ships fleeing from nearby solar systems. But since he'd always enjoyed astronomy, he simply made himself a cup of tea and settled into his garden chair to enjoy the celestial display. The second sign came when every radio and television in the village began receiving broadcasts in languages that didn't exist on Earth. Most of the residents assumed this was some sort of technical problem with the BBC, though Mrs. Pemberton was convinced it was those teenagers again, somehow hacking into the broadcasting system for their own mysterious purposes. The third sign was when a delegation of 17 different alien species arrived in Lower Bumblethwaite's village square, having traveled approximately 47 million light-years to negotiate Earth's surrender. Unfortunately, they arrived on a Tuesday, which was market day, and nobody had warned them about Mrs. Cranklebottom's Tuesday special on seasonal vegetables. "Right," Mrs. Cranklebottom announced as the delegation of bewildered aliens materialized in front of her vegetable stall. "Who wants turnips? Fresh this morning. £2 for a pound, can't say fairer than that." The delegation, which had spent 3 months preparing surrender terms and defensive strategies, found themselves completely unprepared for aggressive vegetable salesmanship. Their leader, Ambassador Quibbleton Flopsworth of the Diplomatic Corps of Centauri Beta, had been expecting to meet with Earth's military leadership. Instead, he found himself being offered root vegetables by an elderly woman who clearly had no concept of interstellar politics. Ambassador Flopsworth began uncertainly, consulting his prepared speech on his diplomatic tablet. "We come in peace, seeking to negotiate terms for—" "Terms nothing," Mrs. Cranklebottom interrupted, waving a particularly impressive turnip at him. "These are the finest turnips in 3 counties, grown in proper soil, not like that hydroponic nonsense they're trying to pass off at the supermarket." The ambassador's universal translator, which had been programmed to handle diplomatic terminology in 4,000 different languages, struggled with concepts like hydroponic nonsense and proper soil. After several seconds of processing, it eventually settled on translating Mrs. Cranklebottom's sales pitch as superior agricultural weapons grown using traditional warfare techniques, not inferior technological alternatives. This translation had an immediate and profound effect on the alien delegation, who suddenly realized they were face to face with someone who appeared to be Earth's Minister of Agricultural Warfare. "Please," Ambassador Flopsworth exclaimed, his diplomatic immunity badge flashing desperately in what he hoped was a gesture of surrender. We come offering terms. Earth's reputation has spread throughout the galaxy. We know about your terrible power." Mrs. Cranklebottom, who had been selling vegetables at Lower Bumblethwaite Market for 23 years and had dealt with far stranger customers than space aliens, took this in stride. "Terrible power. Well, I suppose the carrots are particularly good this week. Grew them myself, I did. Would you like to try one?" She held out a carrot with the same casual confidence she might have used to offer someone a cup of tea. To the alien delegation, however, this appeared to be Earth's agricultural warfare minister, offering them what was clearly some sort of biological weapon. The ensuing panic was spectacular. 3 of the smaller aliens immediately activated their emergency teleportation devices and vanished in puffs of purple smoke. 2 others fainted, which was particularly impressive since they didn't actually have nervous systems as humans understood them. The remaining 12 began frantically broadcasting surrender messages on every frequency they could access. Mrs. Cranklebottom, oblivious to the chaos she had caused, simply shrugged and began arranging her turnips in a more attractive display. She had learned long ago that some customers were more dramatic than others, and if these particular customers wanted to make a fuss over perfectly ordinary vegetables, that was their business. It was at this point that Crimpleton, who had been filming what he assumed was a routine interaction between local merchants and potential customers, realized that his documentary had somehow triggered the largest diplomatic crisis in galactic history. His first instinct was to hide behind the nearest available cover, which happened to be Mrs. Pemberton's parked Morris Minor. His second instinct was to keep filming, because even if he was about to witness the end of civilization as he knew it, it would make excellent documentary footage. What he captured would later be studied by xenoanthropologists for centuries as the perfect example of cross-species miscommunication taken to its logical extreme. The situation escalated further when Prudence arrived to do her weekly shopping and found the village square filled with what appeared to be a convention of science fiction enthusiasts, having some sort of group breakdown. "What's all this, then?" she asked Mrs. Cranklebottom, who was still trying to sell vegetables to beings who were convinced she was offering them weapons of mass destruction. "Search me," Mrs. Cranklebottom replied. "They showed up asking about terms and surrender, then got all excited when I offered them carrots. Foreigners, I expect. You know how they can be about proper vegetables." Prudence, drawing on 30 years of experience dealing with difficult library patrons, decided to take charge of the situation. She approached Ambassador Flapsworth, who was now huddled behind his diplomatic tablet and muttering what sounded like prayers in 17 different languages. "Excuse me," she said in the tone she had once used to quiet rowdy teenagers in the reference section, "but you're blocking the path to the flower stall. If you're going to have some sort of gathering, you need to move along." Ambassador Flapsworth looked up from his tablet and found himself face to face with someone his briefings had identified as one of Earth's most dangerous individuals. According to Crimpleton's documentary, this was the human who had single-handedly repelled the first attempted contact using advanced chemical weapons. Standing before him now, she appeared calm, controlled, and utterly without fear, which, from a diplomatic perspective, made her absolutely terrifying. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible through his species equivalent of vocal cords, "we surrender. Unconditionally. We know about your terrible powers. We've seen the documentary. We know what you're capable of." Prudence blinked. "Documentary? What documentary?" This was, perhaps, the first time in recorded history that someone had achieved galactic fame without actually knowing about it. Prudence's confusion was so genuine, so complete, that it convinced Ambassador Flapsworth that Earth's military commanders were even more sophisticated than he had imagined. Clearly, they had developed psychological warfare techniques so advanced that they could project an aura of innocent bewilderment, while simultaneously radiating an unmistakable sense of barely contained lethality. The The documentary about your survival techniques, he explained, his diplomatic training finally kicking in despite his terror. Your species' adaptation to Class 15 Deathworld conditions, your military prowess, your terrible gardening techniques. My what? Prudence's voice rose to a pitch that made several of the aliens immediately activate their personal shields. What's terrible about my gardening? I'll have you know I've won the Lower Bumblethwaite Garden Society competition 3 years running. This statement, filtered through the universal translator and interpreted within the context of Earth being a military powerhouse, came across as, I have dominated regional agricultural warfare competitions for 3 consecutive cycles through superior tactical applications. The remaining aliens immediately began broadcasting emergency messages to their home worlds, updating their military assessments of Earth's capabilities. If their gardening competitions were considered warfare training, then clearly the human capacity for violence was beyond anything they had previously imagined. Meanwhile, Reginald had arrived to see what all the fuss was about and was attempting to apply British politeness to what appeared to be a first contact situation. I say, he said to Ambassador Flapsworth, you lot look like you could use a cup of tea. Bit parched, are you? Long journey. The concept of offering refreshments to a surrendering enemy was so far beyond the ambassador's understanding of military protocol that his universal translator simply gave up and began displaying error messages in colors that didn't exist in normal space-time. But it was Millicent who inadvertently delivered the final blow to galactic peace of mind. Having heard about the commotion in the village square, she had come to investigate and had arrived just in time to witness what appeared to be a rather tense diplomatic situation. Millicent, who had spent her entire life solving problems through the application of organized group activities, immediately identified what she saw as a classic case of social anxiety requiring immediate intervention. Right, she announced in the voice that had once commanded dance floors and could still make grown men stand up straight and pay attention. Everybody in a circle. We're going to do some breathing exercises. The effect on the alien delegation was immediate and catastrophic. In their understanding, they were witnessing Earth's ultimate weapon, a human capable of organizing group activities under combat conditions. The fact that she could maintain such authoritative control while surrounded by what they assumed were her fellow warriors suggested a level of military discipline that defied comprehension. Ambassador Flapsworth's species communicated panic through rapid color changes, and he was now cycling through the entire visible spectrum at approximately 30 changes per second. She's organizing tactical formations, he gasped. Breathing coordination protocols. This is clearly preparation for some sort of coordinated assault. What happened next would be remembered in diplomatic circles as the Great Misunderstanding of 2074, though the residents of Lower Bumblethwaite would always refer to it as that Tuesday when those odd theatre people showed up. Millicent, interpreting the aliens' rapid color changes as enthusiasm for her impromptu fitness session, began leading them through what she called her basic relaxation routine. This involved a series of gentle stretching exercises that she had originally developed for her over-60s aerobics class, modified slightly to accommodate beings with tentacles, extra limbs, and geometries that didn't strictly conform to three-dimensional space. Deep breath in, Millicent commanded, demonstrating with the kind of exaggerated gestures she had learned from 40 years of teaching dance. And out. Feel that tension leaving your body. The aliens, who had been trained in diplomatic protocol but not in resistance to organized calisthenics, found themselves involuntarily following her instructions. This was partly due to Millicent's remarkably commanding presence, and partly because several of their species had evolved from hive-mind creatures and were naturally susceptible to group coordination activities. Crimpleton, still filming from behind Mrs. Pemberton's Morris Minor, was frantically updating his documentary commentary. Observe the human military coordinator demonstrating advanced psychological control techniques. Note how the enemy delegation immediately complies with her tactical commands. This appears to be some sort of mass hypnosis protocol designed to neutralize hostile forces through synchronized respiratory manipulation. The situation reached its peak when Dr. Barnaby Whifflebottom arrived to investigate the commotion. Dr. Whifflebottom was Lower Bumblethwaite's only resident with an actual doctorate, though his degree was in agricultural chemistry, and most of his practical experience involved helping local farmers optimize their crop yields through better soil management. "What's all this, then?" Dr. Whifflebottom asked, adjusting his glasses to get a better look at the aliens who were now performing what appeared to be some sort of interpretive dance under Millicent's direction. "Foreign visitors," Prudence explained, still somewhat bewildered by the entire situation. "They seem to think we're dangerous or something. Keep talking about surrendering and documentaries." Dr. Whifflebottom, who possessed the kind of logical mind that came from years of solving agricultural puzzles, immediately began analyzing the situation with scientific precision. "Interesting," he murmured, studying the aliens' behavior patterns. "They appear to be responding to some sort of stimulus. Could be a case of mass hysteria, though I've never seen it manifest quite like this." Ambassador Flapsworth, who had been trying to maintain diplomatic composure while performing breathing exercises, overheard this exchange and nearly collapsed with terror. According to his briefings, Earth was populated by warrior scientists who had somehow managed to survive on an impossible planet. The fact that they were now casually discussing his delegation's behavior as a scientific phenomenon suggested they were conducting some sort of live experiment on captured enemy forces. "Please," he whispered desperately, "we just want to understand how you do it. How do you survive on a Class 15 death world? What makes your species so impossibly resilient?" Dr. Whifflebottom, who had spent his entire career answering questions about soil composition and fertilizer applications, found himself genuinely puzzled by this question. "Survive? Well, I suppose it's mostly a matter of proper planning, really. Good diet, regular exercise, adequate shelter, basic common sense mostly." This answer, filtered through the universal translator and interpreted within the context of survival on a planet that should have been uninhabitable, came across as something like, "Survival requires advanced strategic planning, optimized nutritional warfare, systematic physical conditioning, and superior defensive architecture, standard military protocols." The ambassador's terror reached new heights. Not only were these humans impossibly dangerous, they were so supremely confident in their abilities that they considered survival on a Class 15 death world to be a matter of basic common sense. "But the volcanic activity!" Ambassador Flapsworth exclaimed. "The radiation, the temporal anomalies. How do you cope with Tuesday occurring 3 times per week?" Dr. Whifflebottom blinked. "I'm sorry, could you repeat that? Tuesday occurring 3 times per week? That doesn't make any sense." "According to our records," the ambassador began. "Your records are wrong," Dr. Whifflebottom interrupted, with the kind of scientific authority that came from decades of dealing with agricultural bureaucracy. "Tuesday occurs exactly once per week, same as every other day, has done for as long as anyone can remember. Where on earth did you get the idea that—" He stopped mid-sentence as the implications began to sink in. Being a scientist, Dr. Whifflebottom was naturally inclined toward logical thinking, and it was becoming increasingly clear that there was something fundamentally wrong with whatever information these visitors had been given about Earth. "I think," he said slowly, "we may have a slight communication problem here." This was, perhaps, the understatement of the millennium. What followed was a conversation that would later be studied in diplomatic academies as a perfect example of how assumptions, bureaucratic errors, and universal translation glitches could combine to create a crisis of truly galactic proportions. Dr. Whifflebottom, applying the same methodical approach he used for soil analysis, began systematically dismantling the aliens' understanding of Earth's supposed dangers. He explained that the planet had no catastrophic volcanic activity, no permanent ice age conditions, no toxic atmosphere, and definitely no radiation levels that defied known physics. As for temporal anomalies, he concluded, I can assure you that Tuesday occurs exactly once per week, on schedule, and has never shown any tendency to repeat itself or occur in multiples. Ambassador Flapsworth's universal translator was now producing sounds that roughly approximated the noise a computer might make if it were trying to divide by zero while simultaneously composing opera. But the classification. Class 15 Deathworld, the official survey report. Could I see this report? Dr. Whifflebottom asked with the patience of someone who had spent years explaining why certain fertilizer combinations were inadvisable. What happened next was a masterpiece of scientific deduction. Dr. Whifflebottom examined the survey report, cross-referenced it with Earth's actual planetary data, and within approximately 15 minutes had identified not only the original classification error but also the cascade of bureaucratic mistakes that had perpetuated it for 47 years. Well, he said finally, here's your problem. Someone has classified Earth as simultaneously experiencing every possible planetary disaster. This is clearly a clerical error. Probably someone ticked all the boxes by mistake. The silence that followed this pronouncement was so profound that you could actually hear the universe reconsidering its position on the nature of reality. Ambassador Flapsworth stared at the report, then at Dr. Whifflebottom, then at the residents of Lower Bumblethwaite, who were still going about their Tuesday routines as if the foundation of galactic diplomatic understanding hadn't just collapsed around them. You mean, he said slowly, you're not actually dangerous at all? Well, Prudence replied thoughtfully, I did once make Mrs. Henderson cry during a parish council meeting, but that was mostly because she kept interrupting people and someone needed to tell her. And you don't have advanced military training, the ambassador continued. I was in the Territorial Army for a bit, Reginald offered helpfully, but that was mostly weekend camping trips and learning how to make proper tea under field conditions. And your survival techniques for living on a hostile planet? We shop at the village store, tend our gardens, and try not to be rude to the neighbors, Dr. Whifflebottom explained. Same as most civilized species, I imagine. The ambassador's worldview was undergoing what could only be described as complete structural collapse. Everything his civilization believed about Earth, everything that had triggered the greatest diplomatic crisis in galactic history, everything that had caused 83 different species to censor the documentary about human warfare techniques. All of it was based on a filing error. But then Millicent, who had been listening to this conversation with growing indignation, decided to set the record straight. Now, just a minute, she announced with the kind of righteous fury that had once made her the most feared aerobics instructor in 3 counties. Are you telling me that this entire hullabaloo is because someone filed the wrong paperwork? The ambassador nodded weakly. And for 47 years, your entire galactic civilization has been operating under the assumption that we're some sort of unstoppable military force. Another nod. And nobody, Millicent continued, her voice rising to the pitch that had once been capable of organizing charity bake sales in hostile territory, nobody thought to actually check if the information was correct before making a documentary about it. At this point, Ambassador Flapsworth made a crucial error in judgment. Faced with a clearly agitated human female who had just discovered that her species' reputation was based on bureaucratic incompetence, he attempted to employ what his diplomatic training had taught him was a universal gesture of appeasement. He offered to pay compensation for the inconvenience. Specifically, he offered to pay compensation in the form of advanced galactic technology, including faster-than-light travel, unlimited clean energy, and the secret of immortality. The residents of Lower Bumblethwaite exchanged glances. "Well," Reginald said thoughtfully, "faster-than-light travel might be useful for visiting the grandchildren in Australia. And unlimited clean energy would certainly help with the electricity bills," Prudence added. "Immortality might be pushing it a bit," Dr. Whifflebottom mused, "but I suppose we could negotiate." And that was how the residents of Lower Bumblethwaite accidentally became the first humans to establish formal diplomatic relations with galactic civilization, not through superior military might or advanced technology, but through the far more devastating combination of British politeness and bureaucratic error correction. The documentary that had started the entire crisis was quietly withdrawn from galactic circulation, though bootleg copies continued to circulate on several worlds where the concept of dangerous humans engaging in combat gardening had achieved cult status. Crimpleton, meanwhile, found himself in the unusual position of having created the most successful documentary in galactic history based on a complete misunderstanding of basic facts. Rather than being fired, he was promoted to Senior Director of Interspecies Cultural Documentation, a position that came with its own office, a secretary, and the responsibility for ensuring that future surveys were conducted with slightly more attention to accuracy. The Galactic Confederation established a permanent embassy in Lower Bumblethwaite, housed in what had previously been Mrs. Pemberton's garden shed. Ambassador Flapsworth was assigned as permanent Earth representative, a posting that he initially considered a form of diplomatic exile, but which he eventually grew to enjoy, particularly after discovering the therapeutic benefits of Millicent's aerobics classes. Mrs. Cranklebottom expanded her vegetable stall to include exotic produce from 17 different solar systems, though she maintained that Earth turnips were still superior to anything grown in artificial gravity. Her Tuesday special became famous throughout the local sector of the galaxy, though most alien species continued to purchase her vegetables with the sort of reverent caution usually reserved for handling unstable explosives. Dr. Whifflebottom was invited to join the Galactic Scientific Council, where his expertise in agricultural chemistry proved surprisingly applicable to terraforming projects across 3 different star systems. He declined the offer, citing his commitment to his local research, though he did agree to serve as a consulting advisor, provided all meetings could be conducted via video conference and didn't interfere with his weekly gardening schedule. Prudence was offered the position of Earth's first galactic cultural ambassador, a role that would have involved traveling to distant worlds to explain human customs and traditions. She politely declined, pointing out that someone needed to keep an eye on the village library and that the new interdimensional borrowing system they'd installed was quite complex enough without adding interplanetary diplomacy to her responsibilities. Reginald was approached by the Galactic Tourism Board about developing Earth as a destination for extreme survival tourism, where aliens could experience the thrill of visiting a planet they still weren't entirely convinced was safe. He agreed to serve as a local guide, provided tours were limited to weekdays and didn't interfere with his weekly shopping routine. And Millicent, much to everyone's surprise, accepted an offer to teach human coordination techniques at the Galactic Military Academy. Her classes became legendary throughout the known galaxy, not because they were particularly effective for combat training, but because she was the only instructor in military history who could get recruits from 14 different species to successfully perform synchronized calisthenics while maintaining perfect formation and breathing in harmony. 6 months later, Lower Bumblethwaite had become the unofficial capital of human-alien relations, hosting a steady stream of diplomatic visitors, scientific researchers, cultural exchange students, and the occasional tourist who wanted to see the garden where the famous chemical warfare incident had taken place. The village had adapted to its new role with the same combination of practical pragmatism and mild bewilderment that characterized most major changes in British rural life. Mrs. Henderson had organized a committee to establish proper protocols for alien visitors, including guidelines for tentacle parking and a strict policy regarding the use of translation devices during parish council meetings. The Lower Bumblethwaite Inn had expanded to accommodate guests with unusual physiological requirements, though the landlord maintained that all species were expected to observe proper pub etiquette, regardless of how many dimensions they technically existed in. Most importantly, the Tuesday market had become an institution throughout local galactic space, drawing visitors from dozens of different worlds who came to experience authentic human agricultural warfare techniques and sample Mrs. Cranklebottom's legendary vegetables. But perhaps the most significant change was that Earth's classification had been officially updated from Class 15 Deathworld to Class 1 Standard Biosphere with moderate agricultural activity and exceptionally polite inhabitants. Though if anyone had bothered to ask the residents of Lower Bumblethwaite, they would have said that nothing had really changed at all. They still tended their gardens, attended their fitness classes, did their weekly shopping, and tried not to be rude to their neighbors. The only difference was that some of their neighbors now had tentacles, communicated through color changes, and occasionally required special accommodations for multiple appendages during aerobics class. As Dr. Whifflebottom observed to Ambassador Flapsworth during one of their regular Tuesday afternoon tea sessions, "The universe is a much stranger place than any of us realized, but I suppose that just makes it more interesting." Nay, and in the end, perhaps that was the most human response of all. When faced with the infinite complexity and occasional absurdity of existence, the best you could do was make a proper cup of tea, tend your garden, and try to treat everyone with basic decency, regardless of which solar system they happened to call home. After all, good manners cost nothing, and you never knew when you might need a favor from someone who lived 47 light-years away and happened to have the secret of unlimited clean energy tucked away in their back pocket. The documentary was never officially released, but somehow, in the way that these things happen in a universe governed by cosmic irony and bureaucratic incompetence, bootleg copies continued to circulate throughout the galaxy. It achieved legendary status among several species as either the most terrifying or the most hilarious piece of interspecies entertainment ever produced, depending largely on whether you understood that it was completely fictional. And somewhere in the vast bureaucratic archives of the Galactic Confederation, filed between dangerous temporal anomalies and dietary requirements for silicon-based life forms, there exists a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note attached. The note, written in the careful script of Junior Survey Officer Binglebert Snodgrass during his last day on the job, reads simply, "Sorry about the mix-up. Earth is actually quite nice. Recommend reclassification to Class 1. Also, try the tea. It's surprisingly good." But nobody ever found that note, because it was filed under miscellaneous corrections, which was stored in sub-archive Gamma 779, which had been temporarily relocated to storage facility Delta Prime, which had been accidentally launched into a black hole during a routine filing system reorganization in 2051. And thus, the universe continued to operate according to its fundamental principle, that the most important information is always filed in exactly the place where nobody will ever think to look for it, and that the greatest truths are usually discovered by accident, by people who were looking for something else entirely. In Lower Bumblethwaite, Tuesday still occurred exactly once per week. The petunias bloomed on schedule, and somewhere in the cosmos, 47 different species remained convinced that little old Earth was still the most mysteriously dangerous place in the galaxy, which, considering everything that had happened, was probably exactly the way things should be.